الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا ومولانا محمد الصادق الأمين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله الطاهرين الطيبين وعلى أصحابه أجمعين وعلى أزواجه أمهات المؤمنين وعلى ذريته إلى يوم الدين. سبحانك اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا اللهم علما وعملا متقبلا آمين يا رب العالمين. وبالإسناد المتصل إلى الإمام الحافظ أمير المؤمنين في الحديث أحمد بن علي بن محمد بن حجر العسقلاني رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا به آمين. قال في متن نخبة الفكر في مصطلح أهل الأثر: ثم الطعن aspersion، الطعن في الراوي يعني aspersion on the narrator. إما أن يكون can either be for, and now he lists several reasons. أن يكون لكذب الراوي because of the mendacity of the narrator, and he is an outright liar. أو تهمته بذلك, or his being accused of that. You see now there is a clear distinction between the two. The graver one being the first one. The second one might be something grave, and it might be something unjustified, and it might be also in the wider sense, because kadhib can mean also to be incorrect. So we must double check there. يعني in Arabic, kadhib can have an innocuous sense. So we must be careful. But here, usually, it is not meant in the innocuous sense. If someone is muttaham, it means يعني most يعني very much of the time, or almost always in that context of discussion of the narrators, that he is being accused of forgery. But again, being accused can be justified and it can be unjustified. أو فحش غلطه, or when he is being mistaken is just enormous, يعني to the point of being فاحش, يعني widespread, open, and kind of obvious, unjust, inexcusable, abundant. So فحش غلطه really means كثرة غلطه أو غفلته, or his inattention, inattentiveness, heedlessness, really, because something will come up that is more towards inattentiveness, which is waham. So ghafla is يعني extreme. So we can put ghafla also under fuhsh غلطه, fuhsh غفلته. So it's not just something that is in passing. It is something that qualifies as heedlessness. أو فسقه. So here fisq يعني it's something connected to uprightness, moral status. So lacking moral status. يعني فسق means to deviate from what is right and true. So فلما زاغوا أزاغ الله قلوبهم والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. الفاسقين, sorry, فاسقين. So ظالمين comes up later when it says ومن أظلم ممن افترى على الله الكذب والله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. So in Surah As-Saf, beginning it says فلما زاغوا, when they deviated, والله لا يهدي القوم الفاسقين. So you see, fisq corresponds to izagha, zayr. Zayr is a heavy, terrible accusation and status, which corresponds to, it can correspond to heresy, and not just to a sin that is unconnected to aqidah. So it can be, when it's connected to aqidah, it's even worse. So it includes both. So fasaqa, fasiq is the habitual sinner or the open sinner, rebellious sinner. So it's more than just sin, and it has a moral connotation as well. أو وهمه, or his waham, his inadvertence. You can say now that this is the weaker version of fuhsh al-ghalat, and you can also consider it something like false notion, something that he might think that, yeah, he did narrate that from so and so, but in reality he never did. And then this can be found out either because they never met, or because he himself assured it in his earlier days when his memory was stronger. So, and his students might remember that and correct him. So this is waham, which is also can be termed as delusion. But waham in the linguistic sense is also just imagination, which can be positive also, in the positive sense, in the neutral sense, like Kitab al-Tawahhum of Al-Hakim al-Tirmidhi, or is it Al-Muhasibi? I think either Hakim al-Tirmidhi or Al-Muhasibi, one of the early Sufis, on the circumstances and the scene of the day of resurrection. So bringing, of course, all the verses and reports to bear on that, and then expanding on that and explaining and asking the reader to visualize that, to imagine that and see it before their eyes. So tawahum can have also that sense of just takhayyul, imagination. Imagine it in your khayal. So waham as khayal. See, but now here it is meant in the negative sense of falsely imagining something, conjecturing, like dhan, and it is the wrong dhan, it is the wrong idea. أو مخالفته, or he's contravening and contradicting the trustworthy narrators and narrations. When this happens, and it is something that more than in passing, again, so here we go back to that notion of fuhsh in the background, yani something a little bit inordinate, not something excusable. أو جهالته, or his ignorance, or his being unknown. Sorry, not ignorance, not jahl. So jahala is, I'd say, pronominal or reflexive. It has to do with the person himself, in being unknown. Being unknown as a to be a narrator or as a person even, يعني biography, biographical, biographically, who is he, or what is his status? See, so two types of narration that we'll break down later on. أو بدعته, or his innovation. So as he will break it down later, the innovation can be grave, and so, or it can be something that still makes his narration acceptable, relatively speaking, or conditionally speaking, and it can join up with fisq here. أو سوء حفظه, or his bad memorization. فالأول الموضوع. Now the first of these categories just enumerated, which is كذب الراوي, lying. So that type of hadith produced by such a narrator who lies is the forgery, الموضوع. So which literally means placed, وضع فصار موضوعا, وضعه فصار موضوعا. So he placed it there, so it became placed there, so موضوع. And when we say الموضوع, meaning the subject of something, but here it is used in the technical sense of forgery, like al-muftara, the false, the lie that is claimed to be true, muftara, and invented, made up, murakkab, made up of that has nothing true about it, or okay. والثاني المتروك. Now the second one, which is the accusation of forgery, the accusation of lying, that one is discarded, المتروك. والثالث المنكر على رأي. So matruk is discarded, and munkar is matruk is discarded. Munkar is disclaimed. Disclaimed. So you see, munkar is the opposite of ma'ruf. So recognized is ma'ruf. Munkar is unrecognized, and that would be for the one whose errors are many. فحشي غلطي. So he makes so many mistakes. He makes a lot of mistakes, and you do not recognize this. You do not recognize that, and this is not recognized as something that is truly as he claims that X narrated from Y, for example. This is not recognized. That is one opinion, and he doesn't mention any other here in the method. So that is the opinion he tends to prefer. وَكَذَا الرَّابِعُ وَالْخَامِسُ. And so also munkar, also disclaimed, is the ghafla and the fisq. So munkar al-hadith, when we say that someone is, their hadiths are disclaimed as a rule, they can fall into any one of these categories of having many mistakes, or being heedless, or being fasiq in aqidah, in morals, in his uprightness is not verified. Or he's known not to be upright. Then waham, inadvertence. ثم الوهم إن اطلع عليه بالقرائن وجمع الطرق فالمعلل. Now the inadvertence, if one becomes aware of it and looks upon it, يعني طلع عليه, you become acquainted with it, you discover it. It is discovered through what? Through the circumstantial evidences, through the contexts, the clues, al-qarina, like qarin, so the one that goes with the companion, or the one paired with it, or with you, qarin, a person, for example, a being. Um, so qara'in here is meant as clues, the attending clues around it. Like, for example, he says that so and so narrates it from so and so, but in reality there is a narrator in between. He imagines that there is no narrator in between because they were contemporaries, or even more than that, they were student and teacher. But this particular hadith, no. You see, this is so fine and so difficult. And this is what the mu'allal is. So Ibn Hajar, in his Nuzha, the explanation here of this passage, says the mu'allal is something that only the experts really know. It is really like the jeweler at the shop. You ask them, how can you tell that it's not that it's not a good diamond, or that it's a fake coin, or so it's a bahraj, it's a fraudulent currency, and you say, stay with me, and you will find out, maybe after 30 years or 50 years, So this is how fine this is. And when they say, well, what comes to the heart, what comes to the mind, what the feeling is that this is incorrect. So the Prophet ﷺ himself said, for the general public, that if you hear something related about me, but your hair stands on end at hearing it, then know that it have nothing to do with it. And if you hear something narrated from me, related to me and attributed to me, that your heart and your chest expands upon hearing it, then know that it is from me, that I said it. And this is when they say, the expert of hadith might use terms that are very subjective here to refer to that. You say, نازل عليه نور النبوة. Like, for example, this report, they say this and that about its chain, but the light of prophethood shines upon it. It is clear that that only the prophet is most is qualified to say that, and must have said that. Only he can say such a thing. So because it is beautiful, because it is wise, because it is true. So, and they bring in the heart into effect as the judge of that. So we pray that the heart is a functioning heart, the heart of a wali, and we can trust in that. But that again is a fine context of things. So we must be careful here who is saying that, and when, and in what context, and for what reasons also, if you can read through the lines of that. So this is what Ibn Hajar says, it's reserved for the experts, and it's the domain of the ilal al-hadith. And he says, بالقرائن وجمع الطرق. So it requires to gather together all of the paths of transmission, the chains of the hadith, and when there are many. So it's like a puzzle that you reassemble, and it requires istiqra, which means, wide net, that you cast a wide net of reading. and hearing and knowing the narrators and their narrations, you bring it together and then you form that complete picture. So this is why it's reserved for the the people of many years of experience, such as we mentioned, Abu Hatim, as narrated by his son Ibn Abi Hatim in the Ilal of Hadith, al-Razi, Abu Hatim al-Razi, and Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and Daraqutni, and others like that, of that caliber. ثم المخالفة إن كانت بتغيير السياق فمدرج الإسناد. Now, if the mukhalafa, يعني contravention of another narrator, if it takes place by changing the siyaq. So siyaq here is not the drift of the text, but rather the composition of the chain of transmission. So the names mentioned in that chain of transmission, if there's a change in that, like another narrator is mentioned, or the order is reversed, or something like that, then it can be mudraj al-isnad. It could be that there is an interpolation into the chain of transmission. A narrator is mentioned there who does not belong. So who is contravening? Is it the one that has that narrator inserted, or the one that doesn't? So when you see that everyone else doesn't, you know that it's the one that has it. أو بدمج موقوف بمرفوع, or by integrating the mawquf, the stopped chain, yani stopping at the companion, together with a raised chain, yani going back to the Prophet ﷺ, mentioning that this is actually stated by the Prophet ﷺ. So most, if yani a lot, or if not most of the narrations of Ibn Abbas in tafsir, for example, are mawquf. So that would be a typical context where a narrator might raise it up to the Prophet ﷺ inadvertently, and or for example, in the Hadith, Ibn Abbas also mentioning it from the Prophet ﷺ, it is understood that he most probably, that he might probably have taken it from a senior Sahabi. You see, you would know that when it took place at an earlier time. He mentions it. See, he might mention it even as a mawquf hadith. And it can be also about ghaib, but he mentions it as his own statement. So it is clearly, he has the status of something raised up to the Prophet ﷺ. So in the case of Ibn Abbas, all of these are immaterial, yani, in relation to the authenticity and strength and weights of that report. Because if it is proven true up to Ibn Abbas, that is enough. That's it. We have to accept it. If it is, the chain is authentic up to Ibn Abbas. So we're talking about here the minutiae of when it is not, and if it's someone else, and when it does matter, and if it is usually below the level of companion. But here now, if it is something that can qualify as a fiqhi ruling, like for example, the salam must be short to the right and to the left, like Ibrahim al-Nakha'i said. So this is a maqtu' report at a tabi'i, but it is a faqih among the tabi'in, and it is something that is that others have said as well. But is it something that the Prophet ﷺ himself said? And you will see that also the takbir and the salam, they differ in length between different mazhabs. So some, for the Hanafi mazhab, for example, it has to be curt, short, abrupt, and quick actually. But in the Shafi'i mazhab, it is quite extensive. Allahu Akbar, with the hands on the heart, and the intention being present. And this is so some of the fuqaha prefer that in that school, in the Shafi'i mazhab. So now what that is because it is related from below the level of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Otherwise, it would be something that is non-negotiable between the schools. So, but now if one confuses one with the other, then we call that the mudraj al-matn, the interpolated text. أو بتقديم أو تأخير فالمقلوب, or by putting one narrator in front of the other, then that is the interverted, maqlub, or transposed. Transposition, I would reserve that to qalb, which is the same as the term for the heart. Qalb, like for example, when two letters in a triliteral root are interverted, that is what we call qalb. Okay. And there is, like for example, fanada and nafada, you see, or nafaqa, well, nafaqa, nafada, they all have the same meaning. There are several words like that, which Baydawi calls etymological brothers, because they just have one different letter, but the meaning stays very close together. Yani, nafada, to finish, nafaqa, to pierce through, nafadha, with a dhal, also to pierce through, and also nafas, and the breath that comes through, comes out, and so forth. So he calls that etymological. So now, if sometimes it is the case that there is a sort of interposition of the letter and the qalb, transposition of the letters. So, and the meaning still remains the same. So that is also part of the etymological parentage between the terms. But here, now we're talking about the narrator's name being reversed. This is something that is a grave mistake, even though the correct names are still there in the chain, you see. So then, when you hear Imams like Al-Haythami, for example, in his Majma' al-Zawaid wa Manba' al-Fawaid, that is takhrij of the hadiths found in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad and the books of the compilations of At-Tabarani and the Musnad of Al-Bazzar and the Musnad of Abu Ya'la. He will use the term, for example, رجاله رجال الثقات, رجال الصحيح, or رجاله ثقات. The narrators in the chain are all found in Bukhari and Muslim. Or they are all trustworthy. Now, it comes to the heart that this is a strong chain, but wait, how come the hadith itself is not termed to be sahih? How come the chain itself, before we reach the hadith, the chain itself is not called an isnad sahih? Because it's not. It's just that, the narrators on the surface, you can tell, obviously, that they are all trustworthy in themselves. But is it correct that they narrated from one another in the order given? So that's another work, another task that maybe he did not set to fulfill. If it does not come to mind to him right away, he doesn't, he didn't task himself to actually research it painstakingly for every single of the thousands of hadiths he is covering. See, so it just gives that clue and it tells you to work with it. You can find out. But doesn't mean that it is a tasheeh of the chain, and even less of the hadith, verifying it as sound. So the order, otherwise it is maqloob. أو بزيادة راو أو, or with the addition of a narrator. فالمزيد في متصل الأسانيد. Then it is called the additive or the add-on. It is an add-on narrator or an addition in the chain. في متصل الأسانيد, in the chains that are connected, that are complete. It is complete, and then there is a sort of superfluous addition here. أو بإبداله ولا مرجح, or with the interversion of one narrator with another without a murajjih, يعني without a preponderant solution here. We have to pause. We do not know if this is the case or that is the case. فالمضطرب, we call that the discrepant chain. Discrepant chain, مضطرب. And مضطرب can also be used with discrepant wording. يعني there is no way to decide which is the one that should be retained of two different discrepant wordings that might contradict one another or might differ noticeably from one another. وقد يقع الإبدال عمدا امتحانا. Now this interversion and disorder in the chain can take place on purpose as a test, obviously, as happened to Imam al-Bukhari when he reached Naysabur in Central Asia, and he was tested with 100 hadiths that were distributed among 10 ulama, who after interchanging and interverting their chains and texts with one another, like that, shuffling, and he just found them all out from memory, just like that, off the cuff. And that's when he said, are you finished? When they had finished, all of these 10 ulama with 10 hadiths each. So when the 100 hadiths had been read with the false chains, the interspersed chains, said, are you done? None of these I recognize. Do I recognize? Already at that time, they knew that he had found them out. But to go on then and then, like a computer, correct each chain and linking it to the correct hadith and one by one in the order that they had been read. Now they had to just he tied them up, he tied up their tongues and their hands. They had to submit and surrender to his leadership in that in that art and science. طيب. So that's what he means by عمدا وامتحانا. See here, the one hal is acting upon the previous one. عمدا عمدا is the hal for يقع الإبدال. So the substitution befalls how? عمدا, on purpose. Why on purpose? امتحانا. So on purpose, but why on purpose? As a test. See, so although as a test can also serve as a participial state for يقع الإبدال. Okay. أو بتغيير حروف مع بقاء السياق, or by changing small parts of the text. So حروف can be letters, and it can be words. And in the science of قراءات al-Quran, the readings of the Quran, canonical and non-canonical, حرف is sometimes used to mean the reading of so and so. حرف ibn Mas'ud, it means his reading. So although it is not something that is agreed upon that the Quran was revealed according to 7 huruf means the readings. No, it is just a kind of short form that the ulama used to refer sometimes to the readings, but that doesn't mean that the readings is what is meant in the hadith, because the readings occurred as a convention, you know, a couple of centuries later, a convention on the part of the scholars. And then they became reduced to 7 canonical ones also as a convention, then expanded to 10 to 10 agreed upon canonical readings. And among the non-canonical, there are 4 top non-canonical readings, which include al-Hasan and al-Yazidi and a couple of others that are also the best of the non-canonical readings, but they are not considered Quran because they are not canonical. مع بقاء السياق, يعني, or with a changing of one word or one letter, a couple of letters, or a couple of words, but the chain remains the same. Or it can be a couple of words or a couple of names in the chain, but the chain is still recognizable as the same. بقاء السياق. فالمصحف والمحرف. It is تصحيف and تحريف. So both of these are used in tempering and in manipulation of words or names, but the musahaf, tasheef, has to do with dots. The form of the word is still there. Like, for example, as I might have mentioned already, when the narrators were saying, is this Bishr, is this Nasr, is this Bishr, Yusr, can be Yusr also, because when the dots are missing, you don't know if the first letter is a ba or a ya or a noon, and the second letter, is it a sin or is it a shin? So when this happens, and there's 2 different versions or more, and that is the musahaf, sahaf, dot distorted report. There is distortion in the dotting of the words. But when it is deeper than that, it is the vowels themselves, not the dots, the vowels themselves. Yani the rasm differs. Rasm, the script of the word differs. Then we call that tahrif, muharraf. So there are books on that. For example, Tashif al-Muhaddithin by al-Khattabi and others. Okay. Sometimes they are used interchangeably to mean one and the same thing, and to include all types of temperings of the word and or corruption of the word. When we say corrupted, we can use corrupted in paleography, the science of manuscripts, as a generic term for a type of distortion on the part of the scribe for the orthography of the term. That the orthography is wrong, it's incorrect, because it has been corrupted from this to that. See, so and this, of course, is very, very, very abundant in modern editions, especially with certain publishing houses that have a high output, or when the text, for example, is notoriously difficult to really clinch, like Tafsir al-Baydawi, for example. The modern editions are absolutely crammed with all sorts of horrible corruptions, distortions, and because the manuscripts themselves have variants to that effect, because if the scribes themselves in earlier times, a lot of them being ulama or students of ulama, sometimes were confused by what is meant here, what word is meant. I might make the mistake. What about the non-ulama and careless and heedless and people who do not care at all, publishers and those that they employ? What about them? They are going to make even more mistakes. So that is تصحيف and تحريف. قال ولا يجوز تعمد تغيير المتن بالنقص, and it is impermissible to deliberately change the text of a hadith with abridgment, يعني with something missing. For example, or a verse of Quran, when we mention it, except for certain reasons or by certain people, as he will mention, والمرادف, or with a synonym. You see, so narrating something through the meaning. Like, for example, when we translate something, we are narrating through the meaning. We are certainly not narrating the hadith itself. Literally speaking, this, you are not narrating hadith when you are, or this is not Quran. This is rendering an approximation of its meaning. This is why the pious translators kept those in the titles of their translations, the meanings of the glorious Quran. See, so this respectful distance is the safest, and also before we reach those parameters of safety and respect, the parameter of accuracy, this is not Quran. So don't call it, the study Quran, for example. It is a translation of explanations of the Quran and of the meanings of the terms of the Quran. So it's which is very obvious. So, and it is a kind of tasamuh, which, well, the pious translators did not allow themselves that tasamuh. said, we were going to make it, keep it true and clear. طيب. So he said, except إلا لعالم. So no abridgment, no synonyms, no translation, also we might add for ourselves, because we use, of course, synonyms and renderings, equivalents in a different language altogether, and with abridgment and with addition also, in order to make ourselves understood and to try to be more accurate and so on and so forth. This cannot be done. This is impermissible, except for إلا لعالم, or someone who is knowledgeable and qualified in learning and knowledge and the science. بما يحيل المعاني, someone who knows exactly what changes meanings, what modifies and alters what is supposed to be represented as an equivalent here. And so here, this is enough. This sentence, ولا يجوز تعمد غير متن من نقص بالمرادف إلا لعالم بما يحيل المعاني, that can be put as a as the summary of the condemnation, our condemnation, our standing condemned and guilty in the modern publication business, in the English language and all the other non-Arabic languages, of misrepresenting the Quran and the Hadith as being actually the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the words of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, without respect or even having heard even of this rule, let alone heeding it and taking it to heart. But this is deen, this is religion, this is our creed, our faith system, and this is our heart and soul and our lifeblood that we are talking about. How are we going to represent it? Of course there's going to be mistakes, and of course these mistakes are going to snowball into hellfire-ish things of deviation, of corruption in the true sense, the mortal sense of misrepresenting truth, misrepresenting falsehood as truth, in the name of translating. So this is why everything is key here. I would say especially alimin, except for a alim. So it has to be reserved for them. This is why Imam al-Awza'i, even in his time, of the early imams of fiqh, in the time of that in the 2nd century, he said this science used to be a noble science until those that did not belong to it got into it. And that has to, it's like an explanation of the hadith of the end of times as yafshul qalam, the pen will proliferate. Every one and their brother and cousin will be passing themselves off as a pen holder and a writer and a teacher and a translator, actually misrepresenting right and left, the Quran and the Sunnah. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. So فإن خفي المعنى احتيج إلى شرح الغريب. Now, when the meaning is not clear, it's obscure, it's kind of hidden, khafi, then what is needed is the explanation of the gharib. We had mentioned the mushkil before. Now this is the gharib. Mushkil is when there is apparently a contradiction, as we explained already, but it's reconcilable contradiction between this hadith, that hadith, this wording, that wording, or the hadith and an ayah, and so on and so forth. But the gharib, aghraba, meaning to go far and to estrange oneself to become a stranger, to be different, to be or odd, like those hadiths that are single or only narrated by rare persons, single persons, or one or two persons. But here, what we mean by gharib is the difficult word, the non-Arabic word, especially, but also Arabic words that are just difficult to understand. So, what is the meaning of, for example, strange quadriliterals like Ghadanfar, lion, Rahanfal, also bulky. Like you can tell from the term itself, it refers to a bulky body of a person or animal. Or what is the meaning of وَفَاكِهَةً وَأَبَّا? وَفَاكِهَةً is clear as fruit, but أَبَّا in Surah Abbas, that was left as a gharib, but it was explained also to mean vegetation, nabat, wallahu ta'ala a'lam wa ahkam. So the explanation of the gharib of the Quran, Ibn Qutayba, the explanation of the gharib of the Hadith, Ibn Qutayba also, and other such masters. This is a beautiful science, and Imam As-Suyuti has more than one book on that also, really encyclopedia gathering up what had been said already before his time. And in the Quran and in the Hadith. وَبَيَانِ الْمُشْكِلِ, and clarifying the what causes a problem, because it might cause a difficulty because of that difficulty of the linguistics of the term. And as we said, of the mushkil, يعني apparent contradiction, but reconcilable, and it can be dispelled. ثم الجهالة, and then moving on to the narrator being unknown. وسببها أن الراوي قد تكثر نعوته فيذكر بغير ما اشتهر به لغرض. A narrator might have many different names, يعني descriptives of himself, and so he might be mentioned with other than what he's famous for. Like for example, you say, this is narrated Hafs from Asim, but the other narration from Asim is by who? Shu'bah. But very frequently is referred to as Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr from Asim. It's the same person. And he's famous as both, or either. So you can call him Shu'bah, you can call him Abu Bakr. And so, and he might be mentioned also sometimes by his. Now, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, that's his grandfather. Hanbal is his grandfather. His full correct name is Ahmad ibn Muhammad ibn Hanbal. But if you are going to mention all that every time, it's going to take too long. So Ahmad ibn Hanbal. And the short form for Muslims is Ahmad, Imam Ahmad. We do not say Ibn Hanbal. That is the Orientalist way of referring to him, Ibn Hanbal. So you see the difference. But of course, we mean one and the same person in all these cases. So no knowledge of this sometimes helps. Okay, who is this? Oh, yeah, I know him. So it's not real jahala here. Anyway, it says he might be mentioned differently for a reason. Like, for example, there was a time when the books of, The very name of Ibn Taymiyyah in Syria was forbidden, and so some of his books were published under a different name. For example, Abu al-Abbas al-Harrani, for example, meaning him. So, and actually, his full name is Ahmad ibn Abdul Halim ibn Taymiyyah. It is not Ahmad ibn Taymiyyah. Anyway, so this is the gharad, this is the motive for which he would be mentioned under a different name. And as we mentioned under Tadlis also, the concealment of the narrator, to give the impression that you are mentioning several people, but in fact it's always the same one. And you just want to give that impression. وصنفوا فيه الموضحة موضح clarifier, but you could also geminate it الموضح clarifier, making it clearer. So Al-Khatib al-Baghdadi has such a book where he says, this one is actually this narrator, this name refers to that narrator, is also known as that. وقد يكون مقلا فلا يكثر الأخذ عنه. So he can be someone who narrates very little, and so not many narrate from him. وصنفوا فيه الوحدان, and they compiled about such narrators, the wahdan, the single hadith narrators, for example, wahdan, or the single. There is different types of uniqueness. So wahdan literature covers all of that. So for example, Imam al-Daraqutni has al-Afrad, the single hadiths, the single narrators, that covers that, and others. Al-Ahad wal-Mathani. For example, Ibn Qani has, sorry, no, not Ibn Qani, but Al-Ahad wal-Mathani, Ibn Abi Asim. I think either one. Yeah, I think it's Ibn Abi Asim, Al-Ahad wal-Mathani. The Sahaba that narrate only one or two hadiths. This is such a wonderful and unique expertise to be able to tell who, identify them. Number one as Sahaba, and number two as Sahaba who narrate from the Prophet ﷺ, and number three who narrate precisely this one unique hadith, or these two unique hadiths from the Holy Prophet ﷺ. Now, أو لا يسمى اختصارا. So, or is not mentioned, the narrator is not mentioned as an abridgment, يعني to make it short. وفيه المبهمات, and also part of that is the anonymous mentions. Anonymous mentions. أبهم الراوي عنه. For example, حدثت, it was narrated to me, just to make it short. That's one way, one reason why it's not, the narrator, my authority is not mentioned, just to make it short, because he's not the point. The point is the hadith that I want to make. Or it can be that حدثني الثقة, for some reason, like for example, Sayyidina al-Hasan mentioning that he did not want to mention that Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu, because he did not want, he was in a hostile context, hostile society, or ill-mannered times. So why bring it up and then something will be said. No. So you see, he just skips it altogether. Or like Imam Shafi'i said, حدثني الثقة, the trustworthy one narrated. He doesn't want to mention who. He just says, it's enough for you that he is trustworthy. I say so, so accept it. So we accept, his judgment, because we said he is thiqa, then he's thiqa. That is a high grading, a high rating of a narrator if Imam Shafi'i calls them thiqa. So knowledge of that person is another matter. That is a mubham, anonymous mention. ولا يقبل المبهم ولو أبهم بلفظ التعديل على الأصح. But now here, Ibn Hajar says the sounder position, both positions are sound, but the sounder position is that we do not accept the anonymous mention even when they are declared trustworthy, unless we know who they are, so that it can possibly be double checked, cross checked. Okay, فإن سمي وانفرد واحد عنه, so if he is named and only one narrates from him, فمجهول العين. Now this is the jahala branching off into two categories. The مجهول العين is for someone who is named and only one narrator in the whole corpus of the literature of hadith narrates from that person. I mentioned a type of that hadith before, even in the 6 books. So that is مجهول العين. أو اثنان فصاعدا ولم يوثق, or 2 narrate from him, and or more than 2 narrate from him, but that one was not declared trustworthy. As hard as we look, we cannot find anyone declaring him trustworthy or untrustworthy. It's just there's no judgment being made here. So he is majhul al-hal. His state is unknown. His actual status is of unknown status. And an equivalent of calling him majhul al-hal is وهو المستور. He is the veiled reporter. Mastur, there is a satr, like a curtain over his status. Then he says, ثم البدعة, let's push on. Innovation is either إما بمكفر أو بمفسق, is either for a cause that actually is cause for kufr, for unbelief, to hold such a bid'ah, أو بمفسق, or a cause for fisq. They are fasiq, they are a deviant or a habitual, open or grave sinner. So, for example, they said that some of the great ulama of hadith, great ulama of fiqh, said that there is consensus that the anthropomorphist is a kafir, but others said no. So that status of a consensus for that is not agreed upon. See, so the question is, then it is a definitely bid'ah. There is no question about that, to hold anthropomorphist views. But is it a bid'ah mukaffira or mufassiqa? So, and that changes the status of the narrator to narrate from them or not, or to narrate, with that cloud hanging over them. But if it is a mukaffira, then chances are we will not narrate from them anymore at all. فالأول لا يقبل صاحبها الجمهور. The vast majority of the scholars do not accept the narrations from the first type. والثاني يقبل من لم يكن داعية في الأصح. And there is another version that says داعية إلى بدعته في الأصح. So the second type, it is accepted from whoever is not actually actively calling and proselytizing and teaching and promoting his bid'ah. That is the sounder position. Sounder position because it has the massive weight of Imam al-Bukhari and Imam Muslim narrating from such types. Even though in an earlier generation, Imam Malik did not. He would not narrate from people who, for example, were Qadiriyah and very close to Mu'tazila, for example. Even though they hold some of the views they hold are truly horrendous, and others less horrendous, but still wrong. So, the Shia of also those generations were of a gentler and more, less grave nature in their bid'ah. So Imam Bukhari and Muslim retained their narrations, provided they did not call to their bid'ah. The narration, it's a case-by-case procedure. Provided that it does not call to the bid'ah of Shiaism, then this narration from a Shia through a Shia is accepted. See, as long, of course, as he's considered trustworthy, dabit, meticulous and accurate in their narration in the first place, and of strong memory and so forth. So there are of that type in Bukhari and Muslim. إلا أن يروي ما يقوي بدعته unless, so it's a disconnected exception because he just said before, it is accepted as long as he does not call to his bid'ah. So he cannot say out of that is accepted, and except if he calls to his bid'ah, because he just said as long as he does not. So it is a disconnected exception. استثناء منفصل. إلا, and you can also say إلا in the sense of but, in the sense of لكن. It is like a new statement. But if he narrates what strengthens his innovation, فيرد على المختار, then it is rejected according to the chosen position. Of course, because the shoe fits too well, because it would tend to invalidate his motivation of honesty, since this is exactly what he tends to promote against all odds, against the jumhur, against the majority of the ulama and the Muslims and so forth. So it is rejected. وبه صرح الجوزجاني or جوزجاني, but it's better to say جوزجاني, so that there will not be two sukun next to one another. A meeting of two quiescence is frowned upon. That's why we will say Naqshbandi rather than Naqshbandi, or Naqshbandi, according to some. So Juzajani is the Shaykh of An-Nasa'i, rahimahumullah. He said that explicitly. Okay. Finally, ثم سوء الحفظ, bad memorization, إن كان لازما, if it is always sticking to that narrator, فهو الشاذ على رأي, that is termed shadh, anomalous, irregular, aberrant, according to one opinion. if it is something that is always part of that narrator. He's a shadh narrator. أو طارئا فالمختلط. Or if it is fleeting, passing, in passing, then he's mixed up. مختلط. ومتى توبع السيء الحفظ بمعتبر, and when there is a follow-up for such a narrator who has a poor memory with something that is taken into consideration, معتبر, يعني a report or يعني a follow-up report or a shahid, a witness report that is taken, that can be taken into consideration. يعني it is not so weak that it is not معتبر. وكذا المستور, similarly the one who is unknown in status among the narrators. والمرسل, and or similarly the narrator that expedites his report up to the Prophet ﷺ, skipping the companion that he narrated it from. You can also say والمرسل if we are talking about the report itself. So reporter مرسل, report مرسل. والمدلس same. And the concealed chain, or the concealed concealing narrator, or the concealed chain. Yani there is a narrator that is being concealed by the one narrating from him. So when these are followed up by something that can be taken into consideration to strengthen them, صار حديثهم حسنا, their hadith becomes fair, not in itself, لا لذاته, بل بالمجموع, but through the overall weight of the narrations. Now here there is just one remark to say about سوء الحفظ, which he does not define here, right? So we go to the Nuzha, and he defines it in one place of the Nuzha on page 89 in my second edition. Page 89, he says سوء حفظه هي عبارة عن من يكون غلطه أقل من إصابته. Someone whose mistakes are fewer than his being correct. That is the سيء الحفظ. يعني he does not have a, يعني he has a bad memory, but still, you see, his mistakes are less than he's being correct. Yani he is mostly correct, but he has some mistakes. Then on page 104 of the Nuzha, there is a different definition. It says, وَالْمُرَادُ بِهِ سُوء الْحِفْظ مَنْ لَمْ يَرْجَحْ جَانِبُ إِصَابَتِهِ عَلَى جَانِبِ خَطَئِهِ. The one whose correctness is not preponderant over his being wrong. Meaning it's the reverse meaning. It's the reverse meaning. Now, Sakhawi, the student of Ibn Hajar, said that here the term lam was intercalated, muqham, and it doesn't belong there. It shouldn't be man lam yarjah. It should be man yarjahu janibu isabatihi ala janibi khata'ihi, which then becomes the same statement as the other page. And the one whose correctness is preponderant over his being wrong, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. صلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. Inshallah, we'll continue next time.